to half a meter per second. This provoked the deposit of large particles of sediment. Then, as the deposit thickened, the speed of current was increased back to 1 meter per second, and laminae deposited on the large particles. So the deposit was composed from top to bottom of beds or strata of small particles, large particles, and small particles. The three superposed beds prograded together from upstream to downstream. The slope, exceeding an angle of 30 degrees, highlights the inaccuracy of the principle of original horizontality, which states that layers
automatically forming
horizontally. It must be remembered that this principle is used by geologists to interpret past conditions producing the sedimentary rock we see today. As with particles of sediment, organisms get swept along laterally by strong currents and deposited successively in sediments in which they become fossils. When the sediments hardened into rock, the position of the fossils provided no indication of age. Fossil 1, in the upper strata for instance, was deposited before fossil 2 in the lower strata. Fossil 1 could therefore be older than fossil 2.
So that, whoa, I do apologize for that. So I like that video because it's a good representation. You can see it in action. What that's showing you is that in water that is standing, you get layers forming. In water that is moving, you get layers forming. And when it's moving, you could have something that was actually older be deposited above a fossil that's younger than that. So this whole idea of whatever is buried below something, it has to be older, that is not true. And there are examples, for example, horses. When you look at where they've actually found horse fossils and what they say is supposedly horse evolution, you get some that are younger underneath ones that are older, and they don't really have any explanation for that. One of the evidences that they try to say is a good evidence against a global flood is that they find mud cracks in different layers, and they try to say, well, they had to have time to dry before you could lay another one down. That's not necessarily true. Desiccation cracks are ones that they would be referring to. Ones that, mud dries over time, it gets cracks in it. But there are two other types of cracks that can form underwater. One is driven by osmosis, which would be a high salt content. If you look at the oceans today, think of how much salt is in them. It is very plausible that there was a lot of salt in the water during the flood. And then other substratal cracks, just based on compression and pressure, you can end up with cracks. This is underneath the mud. It still is forming cracks. Some of the other evidences that evolution tries to use against creation theory on the flood. They say there's a lack of erosion in most geologic strata, but when you're thinking of a global flood, you wouldn't expect there to be erosion. These layers are being laid down very, very rapidly. A lot of times, when they find tree trunks, these polystrate trees, or they find rootlets, but they hardly ever find them together. It means that there was water rushing past so quickly that it ripped the tree trunks away from the roots. And this is a good representation of that. You see, this was an actual drawing of something that they've found. This would be a polystrate tree trunk, and then you see all of these rootlets that are found by themselves. The trunks were ripped away from the roots, and then they were all buried together. And what is really interesting is what they found is a lot of the times when they find these rootlets, the sediments that they're buried in are not the sediments that are found in the roots, which means they were ripped up so quickly that the new sediment was forced into the roots. Erratics are very large boulders that they really have no explanation of how they got there. In Conway, New Hampshire, they've got one that is 136,800 feet cubed. It's 10,000 tons. It's about the load of a large cargo ship. Covers 3/4 of an acre. It's okay. All right. We crashed. And then they're basically in Canada, they have a boulder they've named the Ototox boulder. It's composed of 2 pieces of quartzite, and it is more than 18,000 tons. This is the picture of it. This is like a farmhouse in the background. Here's a little, a sign, and this is the boulder itself. It would make sense if there were hills and things like that around here for there to be such a large piece of rock. You could say it eroded over time. But for this to be a boulder this size just randomly planted here, you would have to have a massive amount of water to move that, or some sort of force. It would make the most sense that there would be a lot of water. And there are scientists today, even secular scientists, that believe there was a global flood at some point. When you think of oil and gas and all the fossil fuels we have today, they will tell you they formed over millions of years. They will say the same thing about diamonds as well. But the question is, do they really take millions of years to form? The answer is no. There's a factory in Missouri that has actually been able to make light crude oil out of turkey guts and other carboniferous materials. And they were able to do that in not more than an hour. What they found is all that it takes for oil to be produced is the right amount of pressure and the right amount of heat. That's all that it takes. And when you think of a global flood, you've got all this catastrophic plate tectonics occurring. You have underwater volcanic activity. There's more than enough pressure and heat for all of these things to have formed within a matter of days, weeks, or months. And also, think of how much coal and oil we have today. They tell us, how many years we have left in it. It's quite a bit. Think of how much we're using every year, and we still have that much. There must have been a lot of life on the planet at the time of the flood, because we can see evidence of that just by how much oil and gas and coal that we do have. The biggest question, I think, what actually caused the flood? It was a Christian scientific group, and they called themselves the RAPE Project, and they were doing radioactive studies of radioactive decay. And what they found is the helium and zircon crystals, which helium is produced as a byproduct of nuclear decay. They analyzed that, and they found that it was direct evidence there had to be either 6,000 plus or minus 2,000 years old. No more than that. What they also found was that at least once, if not twice, in the history of the Earth, the rate of decay in things like uranium, polonium, carbon-14, all that, had to have increased exponentially. And they believe that that is what actually caused the flood. Because when you look at the biblical account, it says the waters of the deep gushed up. A lot of people say, well, where did all the water come from? It came from below. If you remember, before the flood, the earth was watered from the ground up, not vice versa. So where did all that water go? When you look at the earth today, more than roughly 80% of it is covered in water. And what we found is the rock formations like the Himalayas and Mount Everest, all those very tall mountains, would not have existed before the flood. But because of all these plates crashing into each other during the flood, what we end up with after the flood is a very much lower ocean basin and a higher crust. Essentially, the ocean got deeper and the crust got higher. So are we de-evolving after the flood? I think we are. And we're going to go back to that picture that I showed you at the beginning, and I'll show you why I think that. Josephus was another historian, biblical historian, that studied this. And the Bible talks about how God gave sort of a timeline for how long we could live after the flood. And to go back to this, here we have Adam living 930 years, according to the Bible. But then we come down to Abraham, he only lived 175. Even between just Adam and Abraham, we have a difference of almost 800 years in lifespan. And this line represents when the flood occurred. You can see before that how long people were typically living. They were living in the matter of, upwards of 800 years at least. After the flood, you go from, very rapidly, go from about 600 down to about 200. So this is even more evidence. The writers of the Bible could not have known that we were going to be teaching on the flood thousands of years later. So the fact that they recorded this, it demonstrates that right after the flood, the environment was so different, it was hostile to human life. It was hostile to life in general. Things couldn't live like they could before. And that is essentially the presentation on Noah's flood.